The unveiling of the company of heaven. Every man and every woman is a star.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Free Radical Media Podcast. I am Eric Scott Picard, joined as always by my co-founder and co-host Patrick Ryan. We've got a pretty special show for you tonight. We have a local fellow, semi-local person, Dr. Christopher Bache, who both myself and Patrick have been familiar with in our local area. An eminent person. I'm going to read from his bio right now. Chris Bache, PhD, is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Youngstown State University, where he taught for over 35 years in psychology of religion, transpersonal studies, Buddhism, and world religions. He is also adjunct professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, and for 2 years was director of transformative learning at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Petaluma, California. An award-winning teacher and international speaker, his work explores the philosophical implications of deep, non-ordinary states of consciousness, especially psychedelic states. He has written a pioneering book in psychedelic philosophy and collective consciousness, Dark Night, Early Dawn, which I'll underline that you should all probably pick up a copy of Dark Night, Early Dawn. In addition, he has written Life Cycles, a comprehensive study of reincarnation and karma in light of new information emerging in contemporary consciousness research. In his book, The Living Classroom, Chris presents his revolutionary ideas concerning transpersonal dimensions of teaching. In addition to working with sacred medicines, Chris has been a Buddhist practitioner for many years. So that's this fellow's bio. I'd like to introduce you all to him. Dr. Bache, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the show.
It's an honor to be here with you guys this evening.
Welcome.
So I suppose we should begin. First of all, as I said during your bio, Dark Night, Early Dawn is a book that was, it deeply affected my line of thinking. I'm sure that's true of Patrick as well. I mean, I know we both read the book. We both were affected by the book. I'd like to talk a little bit about Dark Night, Early Dawn, what it's about, and your, the philosophical, intellectual underpinnings of that book.
Mm-hmm. Well, basically, I think psychedelics are in the process of having a huge impact in clinical psychology as psychedelic research begins to be resumed again after about a 40-year hiatus since it was made illegal in 1969. And I think it will also have subsequently a huge impact on the doing of philosophy. And we first saw this indicated in William James' The Variety of Mystical Experiences, because William James was deeply influenced by his own psychedelic experiences, primarily with nitrous oxide. And in Dark Night, Early Dawn, I basically am approaching this as an exercise, as kind of a prototype in doing philosophy within the psychedelic medium. And the methodology involves, and I can't emphasize this too much, systematically and critically entering into non-ordinary states of consciousness. And then after your day is over, coming back out of that, within 24 to 48 hours, writing up a phenomenologically complete description of the experience, being as complete and as carefully framed as possible, and then subjecting those experiences to all the rigors of philosophical examination. And if this is kept up over a long enough period of time, we find that one's experiences go deeper and deeper into consciousness, moving through the various levels of consciousness. But it's not, as a philosophical discipline, of course, it's not sufficient to simply have deep and moving experiences. One must submit those experiences to critical analysis. In addition, they must be submitted to collective critical analysis. So what one person experiences may be interesting and have an interesting story to tell, but in the end, what we want to do is have a comparative analysis of multiple people's experiences, very carefully indexed according to the type of substance used, the dose used, the setting of the circumstances of one's sessions, trying to stabilize and standardize the variables as much as possible. And then once we have that sort of social and intellectual context set, then we can begin to make progress on seeing how far we can push the boundaries of consciousness and what we can learn in these non-ordinary states that might be of value to our existence, to our understanding of the life process. So that's what I'm doing in Dark Night, Early Dawn. And the reference to Dark Night, Early Dawn refers to the dark night of the soul in mystical traditions. And the dark night of the soul is that phase of mystical development which is immediately prior, which may mean years and years prior, but prior to the deepest breakthroughs into mystical oneness, deep experiences of oneness with the universe. It's a time of tremendous purging. It's a time of tremendous confrontation with existential limits, so on and so forth. But my emphasis here, as suggested on the cover of the book, is not the dark night of the individual soul, but it's the dark night of our collective soul. I'm using mystical experience or mystical autobiography kind of as a prototype for understanding the larger story of humanity's evolutionary process. And the suggestion here is that we are entering, or have entered, and will continue to enter more deeply into a dark night of the soul as a planet, as a species. And that dark night of the soul is moving us towards a new chapter in human history, which I'm kind of pointing to as the early dawn. I don't think we're in the dawn. I think the dawn is a ways off. The full sunrise is a way off. But I think we can get some intimations of the early stages of dawn that's on the horizon. So that's what I'm doing. I'm working that front. I'm also incorporating research from near-death episode studies, from out-of-body research studies, and I'm looking at the ways in which the spiritual practices of an individual open up into the collective psyche, and the ways in which the collective psyche actually shape the experiences that individuals have in their own transformative practice. So that's the basic frame.
It seems pretty much unanimous amongst people that have really delved into these deeper states of consciousness, the archetype of transformation. But one of the biggest arguments that I've heard a lot of reductionists sort of give is, how does one distinguish between the collective and the individual?
Well, yeah, understandable, an understandable objection. And it's not always easy to tell. I mean, you're dealing at the boundaries of consciousness. You're dealing in territory that in our culture is largely uncharted territory. Other cultures have charted this territory much more carefully than we have. The great meditational cultures have charted this territory more. And so it sometimes is difficult to sort of know where one is in the larger landscape of consciousness. But having said that, I think the more pioneers are pushing these boundaries, the more one can say with increasing certainty that there are certain fundamental openings that one goes through. There is a cyclic death and rebirth process. And there's no going into these deep states without sooner or later entering into what some people call the death domain, and I would call it the death and rebirth cycle. And that is, in the beginning, we start the way we are in time and space. We start with as our ego. We start as an individual personality with all the conditioning of an individual personality. And if one goes very deep, sooner or later, one comes to a crisis where the identity that we have always assumed ourselves to be is ultimately shattered. It's taken away from us. It's usually a very agonizing process. But finally, when one submits to this death and rebirth process, one loses complete control of one's life. One loses one's ability to understand what's happening from any frame of reference that you are familiar with. One goes through a complete collapse of your sense of reality. One dies. And it is not just, I mean, it's not a biological death, but it is not simply a symbolic death. It's a true psychological collapse and implosion. Mm-hmm. And then, quite to your surprise, one awakens. One awakens in a new context. One awakens into a larger world. One awakens in a completely different metaphysical horizon. One is reborn, not in a Pentecostal sense, but one truly is awakened into a different state of consciousness. And what we find is that if you go through this process deeply enough, and if you go through it frequently enough, so this is not something which is finished in one day, but it takes many sessions to sort of go through this entire process, one eventually awakens into dimensions of consciousness that are trans-individual. They are transpersonal. It's just the landscape is transpersonal. And one knows that that is the world that one has entered because that's simply the nature of the horizon that one is seeing, that one is participating in. One begins to encounter different dimensions of being and different types of residents of those dimensions. And one enters into what Carl Jung heroically mapped as the collective psyche, the collective unconscious. It turns out that our individual mind is kind of like a lagoon on the edge of the ocean. One can go from the individual mind straight into the ocean itself, and from that point of entry into the ocean can go into any other dimension and any other lagoon on the ocean, any other part of the world. And it's something like that in the psyche. When you die as an individual psyche, one awakens into some dimension of the collective psyche, and you can return to those dimensions and learn the lay of that landscape.
It's fascinating. It definitely it certainly correlates with my own, experiences or quote unquote transpersonal experiences, and it really, I mean, from my counter argument to that reductionistic rebuttal is sort of, look around you. I mean, to experience a transformative, transpersonal, or in the transpersonal domain, to experience what transformation looks like on a global or collective scale, coming out of it and going back to the world, I think when you look around and look at the state of what is actually going on, it kind of is proof that it isn't just, mere delusion or mere hallucination, that there's definitely some sort of uncovering or transformative process at work, without a doubt.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I've often thought, when you talk about taking these ideas to the level of our species itself, I've often argued that it seems to me at this point in time that our species is going through, what you might call a dark night of the soul or an existential crisis. Usually I use the term existential crisis. That there's certainly something in the collective unconsciousness that is very akin to Sartre's idea of an existential crisis. It's a fundamental. There's something fundamentally wrong in the consciousness now that is I don't know. I feel like we are in a transitional period.
Yeah, basically, we're at a time in history. Look, we only got the big brain, this big 50% jump in our brain capacity, what, couple million years ago. We began to wake up as Homo sapiens sapiens, what, 35, 50,000 years ago. We just broke through the surface levels of consciousness in any systematic fashion about 5,000 years ago. We began to, with meditation and various spiritual practices, began to push our awareness beyond the boundaries of the personal unconscious. And of course, the collective psyche, what we find is when we do that, we find that our individual psyche is a fractal manifestation or embodiment of a much larger collective field of consciousness, the species field. But that's not, of course, as far as the journey goes. That when one pushes even farther, one goes through more cycles of death and rebirth, where one even begins to die out of the collective psyche into even deeper fields of consciousness, and can begin to go through dimensions of death and rebirth where literally you begin to die out of time and space to enter domains of spiritual reality that are trans-temporal, trans-spatial, which are far beyond the boundaries of the personal psyche. That's when one, enters classically dimensions of spiritual existence, which have been mapped to varying degrees by the great mystical traditions and meditative traditions of both Eastern and Western spiritual traditions. And I think we are coming at a crisis point in history, because basically our culture is a culture which has been developed by a species which is only has developed egoic consciousness. It has developed and refined an acute sense of our individual consciousness. And we've built a society, we've built a culture based upon egoic consciousness. And one of the features of egoic consciousness is I can injure you and it doesn't hurt me to do so. I mean, basically, because I am separate from you. So if we're both applying for a job at the office, and I can plant lies that undermine your ability to secure this job, you don't get the job, I get the job, I get the salary, my life is enhanced, your life is diminished, but because, and we think that we are separate from each other because we're each separate, functioning out of egoic consciousness, and so I can hurt somebody else and it doesn't really hurt me. I can cause hunger in the world and it doesn't reverberate back to me. When one moves into, and I think basically we've constructed a culture like this, which basically gives preferential treatment to certain groups, certain nations, certain races, certain religions, whatever, at the expense of others, and we think we're winning. We're going to win this game, and that's not a viable way to run the planet when the top 1% of the population controls an enormously disproportionate percentage of the world's resources. The top 20% of the people control 87.5% of the world's resources, creating these huge imbalances. You can't run a planet that way. And I think we're driving the planet to a point of collapse, of fundamental collapse, social and environmental collapse. And I think in order to move through this crisis that's coming at us very fast, we have to literally not just change our social systems and not just change our economic and political and ecological systems, but we have to fundamentally change the foundation of consciousness that we're operating out of. We have to let our hearts expand as large as our minds so that we can feel the underlying fabric of unity in which we are all embedded. And once we feel this fundamental oneness with all life forms, then we naturally don't want to hurt other beings. We don't want to injure them. And I'm not talking just about human beings, of course, but also other, what the Buddhists call sentient life forms, any life forms capable of feeling.
Right. Yeah. Right. And, I read a horrific article today about, They're finding multitudes of dolphins off the coast of Japan washing up on shore with radiated lungs. And, it's like, does it really have to take us destroying the planet to sort of, like you said, transcend social structure and transcend ideological background to really reach that common ground, both literal and metaphorical? It's like we really need to reattune ourselves to what we all share. And it is the earth. We all come from this earth. And it's like the one thing that we could all sort of get behind and join together to sort of protect and reestablish itself. Because, it really is reaching that critical point where we don't have very much time left. And if we don't sort of grow up and get our shit together and realize that it's sort of do or die,
what are we trying to win? To use your analogy, what are people trying to win exactly? What's the prize? This rat race we've constructed for ourselves. There's no prize. There's no winning.
Yeah.
So what's the point of it? So I agree with you completely. We need to fundamentally change the way that we think about the way that we live.
And I think psychedelics can be very helpful in this respect, because in the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century, with the rise of science, and there's such an important, profound breakthrough, the rise of science. But basically, with that transition, we walked away from the religions of the patristic period of the last 5,000 years. We basically became convinced that by understanding the physical world, we would be able to bring about the forms of social transformation that religion had always aspired to: less pain, less suffering, less disease, more happiness, more well-being. But then eventually that moved in a certain philosophical direction where we became convinced that the physical world is the only world that exists. In the beginning, it was the physical world is the only world we can study with precision, so we're going to restrict ourselves to studying it. But then we became convinced that the physical world is the only world that exists, so that we are just material beings. We were brought into existence through the combination of chance screened by necessity, the survival of the fittest, spontaneous mutation plus the survival of the fittest. And we are our brain. So when our brains die, our mind dies, we disappear completely. And that's a pretty deeply pessimistic philosophy, which basically says your life is an accident. It's a cosmic mistake, or cosmic accident at least. And there is no meaning built into the fabric of your life. And you're just a physical being, so you should be able to satisfy yourself with just physical experience. And so that leads us to go out and grab as much physical experience as we can, and to collect as many physical objects in order to gratify this fundamental need that we all want to be happy. But of course, what we're finding is that once you get past the bare minimum, the basic minimums of food and clothing and shelter, making more money does not result in greater psychological or social happiness. And here psychedelics can be helpful because you don't have to have a great number of experiences. You can have, with just a modest amount of pushing the boundaries of consciousness with psychedelics, you can have a kind of popping the bubble breakthrough in which you can experience that there is in fact another reality behind, I hesitate to use the word behind, but behind or within physical existence. There is another universe behind the physical universe. The physical universe is the daughter universe. There is a mother universe out of which the Big Bang came, which is constantly pouring energy into and through the daughter universe. And even just to have a momentary glimpse, a touch of that universe, completely shatters the dream that we are just physical beings. And that opens up the possibility that we should be aspiring towards more than just physical gratification, and we should be aspiring to some type of larger collective realization, not just an individual realization, but a deeper spiritual realization, or a realization that's not contingent upon just more and more physical objects.
Right, right.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely, sure.
Or to put another way, just not contingent on our own individual limited ego, and really stepping outside that, and totally seeing the interconnection or ultimate unity of that ego with everything else. It's funny because it's like, to me, I think one of the big things that's gonna have to come inevitably is if you look at scientific study of these altered states, which seems to be, it's almost like we're going to almost need to reevaluate the whole scientific method when we sort of really delve into something that's so, limited to the individual experience. I mean, I'm sure you could look at, different transpersonal experiences through large amounts of people. But I mean, how could you use the scientific method to really study a psychedelic or transpersonal experience? Or what?
Especially when it's limited to this Cartesian view.
Right.
Like that Cartesian view of reality. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, of course, we should. First, I don't have any complaints with the scientific method. I mean, I really think science is really important. And science itself has outgrown its Cartesian origins. So science itself has outgrown the Newtonian worldview, the mechanistic worldview, with quantum physics in the 1930s and relativity theory and the process that's continued. So what we want to do, however, is take the same kind of critical discipline that has been used in science and find how to apply it to this new category of psychological experiences. So I think, for example, we can use what we've learned about standardized testing and standardization of variables. What we want to do is for example, we could get 100 people, highly educated people, PhDs, MDs, if you want, masters of fine arts. We could get a spectrum, and we could make sure we had a good randomized population within a, sociologically, psychological type, so on and so forth. And then we could run them through a protocol once a month using a very specific kind of protocol with a very specific substance. And we have a lot of history with these protocols. We have 75 years of research on psychedelics, much of it done before the 1970 prohibition. We could standardize our point of entry, and we could then be very systematic in our gathering of experiences. And then we could submit those experiences to very careful comparative analysis. I mean, we have to adapt the rigor of scientific inquiry to this new territory of experience. And I think we are. I mean, we're in the process of doing that. It's already starting in the clinical sciences. Basically, we are beginning to use research protocols for applying psilocybin, MDMA, ibogaine, even LSD to certain instances of pathology, certain types of problems, or to people who are in the process of facing death. So they're pretty, depressed because they're going to die. And we're doing research on using psilocybin to basically expand their experiences to see if we can help them shift their belief system around what's waiting for them at death. Okay, so this is happening with the focus being on the healing of the individual. But we've already known from research done before the 1970s that when you begin to excavate the personal psyche, when you begin to go deeper and deeper beneath consciousness and go into the personal unconscious, and you begin to clean out the basement and work out the anxieties and problems and tensions and bruises of the personal psyche, sooner or later you come to a point where you move beyond the personal unconscious, moving deeper into consciousness, into the collective unconscious, into the consciousness of life itself. Literally, I think, the mind of the cosmos itself. Now, so we can start, this whole resurgence of psychedelic research is starting on a clinical basis, trying to heal the individual psyche. But it's only a matter of time before this naturally is going to deepen, where we begin to transcend the individual psyche and move into the collective psyche, into the mind of the cosmos. That's when the philosopher's ears really pick up and begins to realize the relationship between what we are doing, working with these psychedelics, and the classic philosophical questions. Is life meaningful? Is there a meaning to it? Is there an intelligence operating inside existence? Is life paying attention to us, or is it coldly indifferent to us? Is there anything waiting for us that's intelligent and benign when we die? We can explore these questions today more radically than we've ever been able to explore them in the West in history before.
Yeah, and in a critical standpoint, let's talk a little bit more about. I'd like to talk a little bit more about your work with psychedelics. Then, like furthermore, what do you see as the potential of some of these psychedelic substances? For the future of consciousness, for the future of research, psychology?
Well, in general, don't you find that people's judgments, their value judgments, their belief systems are largely a function of the experiences they've had? I mean, Shakespeare said as much. And so if your experiences are largely limited to time-space reality, then your judgments basically will be structured by your convictions about time-space reality. And if you want to believe that there's more than just time-space reality, you can believe whatever you want, but basically it won't have the same depth of conviction as your experiences of time and space reality, which is an everyday kind of experience. In this respect, our culture is, I differentiate between what you might call a daylight culture and a nighttime culture. Imagine that you lived in a world where you had a fundamental rule that you had to be in bed, you had to be behind closed doors by sundown, and you were not allowed to come out of your house until sunrise. So basically, imagine that you had a culture that never, ever, ever saw the nighttime sky, never saw the stars. You had a completely daytime worldview. You could live, you could hunt, daytime animals, you could plant, you could have a completely satisfying life, but you would never be able to answer the question, how did we get here? Because you would never develop astronomy, you'd never develop a larger cosmology. You would be restricted to your daytime experience. And I think something like that is where we are psychologically, culturally. We are restricted. We have restricted ourselves to a daytime world of the ego's experience of time and space reality. But there is a nighttime world. There is a larger reality beyond that. And so we know that it's not just psychedelics, of course, and psychedelics are a red herring in the sense because meditation can take us into these domains, trance dancing, any number of techniques can take us into these non-ordinary states. But just going back to psychedelics, we know that certain substances, there are about 300 naturally occurring psychedelic substances in nature. We've synthesized over 5,000 psychedelic substances beyond those that occur in nature. A lot of these substances have the capacity to hyper-amplify consciousness, and that's how I understand psychedelics. True psychedelics, they don't give you an experience. They don't cause you to experience certain specific things. What they do is they hyper-arouse consciousness. They hyper-amplify consciousness. They catalyze different levels of consciousness that are innately present in your system. And when you amplify consciousness, your consciousness begins to open, and it goes through a spontaneous detoxification process where it begins to deal with all those things that have kept your consciousness small, tight, constricted, defensive. And as one moves through those various obstacles and challenges, consciousness continues to open and open deeper and deeper, so that psychedelics don't give you a particular experience. They energize your consciousness, and as your consciousness opens, you begin to experience a larger spectrum of reality. And I think when we begin to systematically, as a people, make available clinics, circumstances where we can systematically explore these realities, it's going to change our worldview, because we won't any longer be a daylight culture. We will be a daylight and a nighttime culture. We'll understand that there are physical laws and physical realities, and there are these extra-physical realities that work by extra-physical laws, and a human being is a being who basically migrates back and forth between time, space, and this deeper reality, because one of the things that comes up in psychedelic experiences a lot is the experience of reincarnation. That is the discovery that our mind is older than our body. Mm-hmm. And our mind is conditioned by experiences that this body has not had, that there are dimensions of our personal story which extend back in time, and therefore we have reasons to believe will extend forward into the future. This has nothing to do particularly with psychedelics, because the deep meditation cultures of the East have come to the same conclusion, that reincarnation is just a simple fact of life. So we're basically moving back and forth between the spiritual world, or the extra-physical world, and the physical world. Even just to see that, to understand that our present life is part of an evolutionary journey that has been going on for thousands and thousands of years, and that will continue to go on for thousands and thousands, say millions, billions more years. That changes your reflections on what the purpose and project of life is. It gives us a larger context.
Wow.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's fascinating. It's funny too. One of the big questions that I've always pondered with all of this is, when you really get deep into it, it's like, was the fall from acknowledging the nighttime consciousness, as you called it, was that fall away from that, was that part of the, ingenious plan of the universe, or was it just foolish humans?
I don't think in terms of a fall. If there was a fall, it took place at the Big Bang. Meaning, I think the non-physical universe, the mother universe, self-manifested the physical universe, self-manifested at that moment of the Big Bang of 13.7 billion years ago, and we don't know how many expansions and contractions have actually taken place. This may not be the only Big Bang. This may be only the most recent Big Bang in an expanding and contracting universe. But I think somehow extra-physical reality manifested physical reality and set in motion the 13.7 billion year journey that has moved us from, the initial Big Bang to where we are today. And to really understand what's happening, we have to keep breaking out of our human constructs. We have to learn how to think the way God thinks, or we have to learn how to think at least the way the universe thinks. And the universe seems to think in terms of horizons of billions and trillions of years. So we have to expand our own frame of reference. If we want to understand ourselves, we have to understand evolution, and we have to understand what the universe is doing. And that puts us on a huge trajectory. Now, I think what happened was about 5,000 years ago, when we began to have experiential contact with the Mother Universe, we began to have these breakthroughs when we began to realize our individuality, Atman, is Brahman, the essence of God. The essence of the individual is the essence of God. We are one with the Tao. We are one with God. When we began to discover that there was this other universe, naturally we developed a story about it, and the story became one of fall and return. That somehow we knew that that's where we really belong, and somehow we got stranded from that reality in this reality, and all the religions of the Western and Eastern religions became religions of up and out escape cosmologies. So as soon as you achieve nirvana, then you don't have to reincarnate anymore. And as soon as you achieve salvation, then you die and you go to heaven, you don't come back. So it's all about getting back home, getting back there. But I think now we've been in this long enough that we're beginning to look larger, and we're beginning to understand that there's a much bigger story going on. And that's why I think the old stories are falling away very fast, the old religious stories, because I think the project is not simply a project of fall and return, but the project is literally to evolve, to transform, so that we integrate more deeply in our time-space reality the qualities of spiritual existence, so that we are becoming more heavenly in our physical incarnation. And that changes the story, because it's not a story of fall and recovery. It's a story of birth. It's a story of being an infant and becoming a child, and then becoming a teenager, and becoming an adult, and becoming wise, and becoming an elder. So here's a question. The whole evolutionary journey up to this point in time, you can't judge a play until the last act of the play. So are we close to the last act, or have we just opened the first act? So if there were 100, are we at the very beginning of our story, or are we at near the very end of our story? So let's ask the universe. We look around, we ask, well, how long will we be here? And by any reckoning, we're just getting started. Really, I mean, we're just beginning to evolve. Historically, we have said human beings are the pinnacle of nature. We are the pinnacle of God's creation. Now we're beginning to understand that a human being is simply a transitional form between a lower evolutionary form and a next higher evolutionary form. So, we are becoming something beyond what we are now in a larger process. And so I don't think it's a matter of falling. I think it's a matter of literally cooperating with creation, with creative process, and making choices that allow us to become more conscious, more empowered, and not abandoning the physical world, because that's part of the old story, is like matter's bad, spirit's good. The new story is to synthesize, to integrate full spiritual consciousness with full physical embodiment. The way the Buddhists say this is nirvana is samsara. Nirvana is samsara.
Yeah, nirvana is samsara, right? Of course. Yeah. It I mean, that really resonates with me, especially because often we talk about. I've talked about the ideas of the last century belong there. I mean, they're essentially dead. We do need new ways of thinking. We need a new coherent way of thinking that encapsulates the natural world, the spiritual world, and the physical world, and integrates them together. And I what resonates with me is I think that's what you're saying, that we need to integrate these things in a useful way.
Sure. Or as like Terence, the late great Terence McKenna used to say, the Archaic Revival was like the last sane moment of human history was looking back prehistory, looking back to our indigenous forefathers, this because they really had a relationship with the earth. They realized that the earth was heaven, was paradise. And it was sort of like that going into what we call history was when things started to become more and more clouded as far as that goes.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful, because indigenous people were more deeply connected to nature, and they understood that their mind was part of a larger mind of nature. But I think it's important for us not to romanticize the past as if, they got it right and we have to get back to where they got it right, because we haven't been doing nothing these many thousands of years. I mean, we really have been making extraordinary progress in all sorts of different dimensions, and we are much more differentiated and self-critical of our past than we've ever been before. Let's remember that a lot of older cultures, they used up their environments within the realm of their technology, just like we are using up our environment. And they also treated their women, in many cases, very badly. So, there's a lot of improvements that have come along the way, and there's a lot of tribal warfare that was part of that ancient past. So, they had certain things really, really beautifully held in some of these traditional indigenous cultures. But I think what we want to do is to combine the very best of our Enlightenment culture, our scientific culture. We want to push beyond that to go forward into a future beyond anything that we can presently imagine. And that is a future which combines the very best of science with the very best of our spiritual practices and spiritual insights, so that we can become something we've never been before.
I agree, and that's why I've got moved away from the term revolutionary, for example, because revolutionary has the connotation of a return to something, right? I've taken to the term evolutionary. We need something completely new and radically different, So I'm not a primitivist. I don't advocate a return to some imagined golden age, because that never existed. What I want to do is look forward. The past is in the past and it belongs there. We need to look forward to new systems, new ways of doing things, radically new and better ways of doing things. We need an evolutionary change, not a revolutionary one.
Yeah, we have to transform our economy. We have to transform our industrial production. We have to move the planet in a green direction. We also have to just work on fundamental redistribution of the resources. One of the phrases that I like very much is the phrase of a book title, "A World That Works for All." Our world doesn't work for all. It just works very well for a very small percentage of the world. We need a world that works for all. And if we can begin to make a world that works for all, then there's no fundamental technological or scientific problem that we won't be able to solve.
Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. Something, in your opinion, within the next couple decades, or even like the next century, when humanity perhaps starts getting solidifying themselves in this sort of unitary consciousness or this unitary awareness, how does that, or how do you foresee that affecting someone on an individual level?
Well, I think everything that an individual does registers not only in their individual psyche, but registers in the collective psyche. And that the transitions, that things that happen to us collectively also shape the experience of our individual experience. So it's a feedback between the individual and the whole, and the whole and the individual. I think the 21st century is shaping up to be a do or die century for our species. Yeah. And I say this not on the basis of psychedelic experiences, though I've had many experiences, visionary experiences, where I've seen this and entered into this reality, as many of us have. But I say this simply paying attention to the ecological forecasters, the economic forecasters. I'm thinking here of the work of Donella Meadows and her team. Any number of long global perspectives. We're heading, this industrial highly toxic industrial society is basically generating a crisis of its own making. We're coming into an oil crisis. We're coming into a water crisis. We're coming into a global climate change crisis, which will involve ultimately mass migrations of billions of people shifting away from coastlines deeper into the planet interior. We've seen in 2008 with the so-called credit crisis, which I think is really a greed crisis, we saw how incredibly vulnerable our international finance system was. And as we move deeper into these deep systemic crises, we're going to find that the system is going to use up its elasticity. It's going to exhaust its flexibility. Its resources will be drying up. And we will be entering into a period of global systems crisis that will involve, inevitably, I think, the death of millions, billions of human beings. I mean, really, some of the estimates have calculated that the carrying capacity of what is called the new Earth, which is a highly polluted Earth, is maybe as low as 1 billion people, maybe optimistically projected 2 billion people. We're going to hit 9 billion people by 2020. So the 21st century, I think, is going to be a century in which, to some degree, there are going to be convulsions, a wave, a series of compression cycles of convulsions of mass crises, which will involve a die-off of a significant portion of the Earth's population. We may lose a half or more of the Earth's population. So I'd like to just pause for a second and let that sink in. That's maybe half, billions and billions of children around the world, mothers and fathers losing their children, losing their brothers and sisters. What is this going to do to us? This is going to be an excruciatingly painful process, and it won't be able to be isolated. It won't happen just in South America or faraway places in Africa. This is going to be happening on our own shores. Out of this crisis, out of this series of crises, I think we're going to come to a crisis of faith, a crisis of a social crisis. I think it'll be not just an economic and political and social crisis. It will also be a fundamental religious crisis, a spiritual crisis. We're going to ask ourselves, how did we ever get ourselves in such a mess as this? How did we ever set in motion the processes which are leading to this much pain? How we respond to this crisis, I think, will determine very quickly whether we will go extinct or whether we will transform ourselves into a higher order of consciousness. If we continue the strategies of the past of divide and conquer, save a few, expend the many, if we continue that strategy, given the nuclear weapons and the biological weapons that we have at our disposal, I think we'll probably go extinct. But if we choose to opt for inclusive solutions, if we decide to create systems that include all, that we all do with less in order to take care of more, I think that could set us on a road to a profound change, not only of our culture and our society, but there's actually there's a transformation that's percolating very, very deep within the collective psyche. The intelligence that has been expressing itself in our evolving universe, that intelligence which brought oxygen forward and brought plants forward in response to the oxygen crisis of early Earth history, that has brought flowering new forms of consciousness forward in a series of punctuated equilibrium crises in our past, that same intelligence is expressing itself in this global systems crisis in this century. I think this intelligence believes that humanity is ready. This intelligence believes that we are ready to become more than we've been in the past. I think it's a toss-up in many ways. And if we go extinct, if our species goes extinct, certainly there are many other planets and other solar systems where evolution will face the same crisis, and hopefully consciousness will make it in some of these other systems. I personally think that we will make it on Earth. That has been the nature of my experience, that we will make it, we will transform, we will give birth to a future human. And this is happening at the collective psyche level. When the collective psyche shifts and pivots, all the individuals within the system experience that from within themselves. The emergence of a new common sense, a new common sense of inclusiveness, a new common sense of our relationship to the earth, a new common sense of taking the long-term perspective. If we don't make this transition, if we keep on holding on to the divide and conquer ways of the past, I think we'll go extinct possibly within a few centuries. This is the critical century. This is the work of your generation. It's the work of your children and your grandchildren. I mean, I think these three generations that are coming in right now, these three generations are going to bear the brunt of the crisis. If we don't turn this around in a fundamental way by the end of the 21st century, then we may not be here by the 25th century.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. You know, that's a stark way of putting it. In a lot of cases, you know, it makes me want to ask the question, you know, is that worst case scenario the price that we have to pay as a species for the manner in which we've lived the last couple of centuries?
Yeah, I don't know. It's not just the last couple of centuries. You know, it's been thousands of years in the making.
The trajectory of the hierarchy, of the domination, of the oppression that we've inflicted upon ourselves. I mean, is that the price we have to pay? I suppose. But I think you're right. This is the key century. I believe we are at a fulcrum of history.
Yeah, I don't know whether we have to. I mean, theoretically we could grow from positive experiences, not just negative experiences, but it looks like we seem more inclined to grow out of pain than out of our joy. And so at least it seems that that's where we're heading now. We're heading into a period of intense pain. Now, I want to say, just to end on, to kind of move towards a positive, not in any way to dilute the intensity of this crisis or the necessity of us making different choices in our individual and our political lives as we enter more deeply into the self-awareness of the consequences of the life that our economy has created. But when I have gone deeply into this in my own experiences in non-ordinary states, when I've gone deeply and for some reason been allowed to move deep into trans-temporal experiences, to experience this crisis in these non-ordinary states and to experience what emerges on the other side of these crises, I think truly we are giving birth to a new human being. We are giving birth to a species of Christs and Buddhas and prophets. I think we're healing the divisions of history that have been carved into our collective hearts and into our collective minds. Remember, in a reincarnating universe, we're not just a collection of 7 billion 100-year-old beings. We're 7 billion, potentially tens of thousands of year-old beings. So we're carrying the whole history of our past inside us. So if we make the right choices, if we begin to pivot on this history, if we begin to choose a different future, one generation can facilitate a change that can, in a sense, absolve our species of a lot of sins. It's a time of grace. And when I have been given the opportunity to somehow touch or to be touched by this future human that's emerging, this being, again, a collective level, this being is such an exquisite being with a mind open into deep and profound communion with the intelligence of the universe, with a heart open profoundly into the one heart of all humanity, the one heart of all sentient life forms. This is a being when we make this transition to a fully awakened human being, a fully redeemed, if you will, human being with this fundamental expansion of emotional, intellectual, spiritual capacity, then that's a species of such beings. That's a turning point in history. That's a species that can take this planet and take us into territory we can't even imagine now, because all our imagination is limited by our fractious and damaging past. Look at what sci-fi does. Sci-fi basically extends cops and robbers into space. That's an incredibly unimaginative way of understanding the evolving future potential.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Yeah. You're absolutely right. I've often thought that. Yeah, I mean, there are interesting within science fiction. There are interesting ideas. There's interesting, categories that people talk about. But you're right. It is severely limited by our current imagination, and I feel like we could open new doors and enter into new systems that we can't even foresee now, that are far more beautiful and far more interesting than anything we can possibly think of today. I feel like we have that potential. I mean, do you agree with that, Dr. Bache? I mean, I feel like human beings have this beautiful potential. I feel like we as a species can attain, moksha. We can attain something very beautiful if we just chose to.
We have that ability. And here's the thing. Jung said it well. He said, the way forward is through the shadow. We can't move into the light without confronting our own darkness. So we have to take responsibility for every shadow in our soul. We have to take responsibility for every darkness that pushes in our own heart, every self-centered. And we can't do this in big steps. We have to work with the steps that are available to us today. We have to live a life now in which we are making choices that build the foundation for a better world. And we have to begin at what's at hand. We have to begin by changing choices about the foods we eat, about how we spend our time, about just how we invest ourselves, and what we're willing to tolerate, what we're willing to support, what we're willing to say no to, and how much we're willing to invest in political struggle, in social struggle. We have a tendency, if we tend to see large, if you do see the larger horizon, and I do this, I get lost in the larger evolutionary horizon. And it's important, I find this for myself, to get grounded back in the next 24 hours, to get grounded back in the next month, to really keep it real. It's about the way forward is through making the small steps of daily transformation. If you take care of the small steps, the large steps will take care of itself.
Sure. And reclaiming responsibility, individual responsibility, like you were saying. I mean, how do we spend our time? Is it watching mindless TV and buying stuff we don't need, or is it paying attention to how we treat others, or what information we delve into? Those very small actions we all take on a daily basis that we're ultimately 100% in control of. We really need to reclaim that,
Yeah, how we treat others and how we treat ourselves, because we have to work on healing the planet, we have to work on healing our culture, and we have to work on healing others and healing ourselves. We all carry these scars. But if we make progress over the course of years, we can change the kind of being that we are. We can make ourselves gentler, kinder, more generous. We can create, waves around us in our community of friends that are gentler, kinder, more adventuresome. We can do this. People are doing this. That's what's so exciting. Your generation is doing this in an extraordinary way.
Well, I honestly, through doing this podcast, we found an incredible amount of optimism. At least I have for the future. You know, I'm very cynical a year and some time ago before we started doing this, and when we started talking to people and looking around the world and seeing what people were doing, you know, I found an incredible optimism that people were actually, you know, the consciousness is changing. That people are doing interesting things. People are trying to build a new society. And it's fundamentally beautiful to me, and it gives me some hope for the future. I mean, it really does.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think we're gonna perish. You know, I think we can persevere through this. I think we're in that shadow period that Jung was talking about, and I think we're gonna pierce that veil.
Yeah. You know, one of the fastest growing social movements of our time is voluntary simplicity. And you don't ever hear about it. You don't, if you watch TV and watch the radio, listen to the radio, you don't hear about it because it doesn't lend itself to the corporate message, which is buy more, consume more. But voluntary simplicity is a very fast growing social movement where people are basically, this is the new sanity. This is doing with less in order to live a better life. Yeah. And things like this are growing up around us all the time. Yes Magazine is, you know, I love to read Yes Magazine because it's about individuals across the planet who are just taking responsibility in their own lives, in their own corner of the world, for making a better world, for making a world in greater ecological balance, more social justice.
Sure. And it's like, is it that hard to really see what doing good is? I mean, to me, it's not like there's really a lot of room for philosophical debate. I mean, to me, doing well for the environment and doing well for another human being is pretty clear cut and easy to see. And it's like, I mean, like we were saying, we're in dire times. I don't want to go to the grave knowing that I was on the wrong side of history when the shit hits the fan. Like I want to go knowing that I did my part and I did everything I could and I tried to spread good information and I tried to help others and tried to help the earth. And if it all fails, it fails. But I think that's what people really need to realize. What side of history do you want to be? Do you want to go knowing you were on? Do you want to help? Do you want to go out knowing that you were ushering in this new civilization? Or do you want to go out, you know, knowing that you were too afraid or too comfortable or too lazy?
You know, or too distracted. Well said. Well said.
Absolutely. Dr. Bache, we're about at our time. This is yet another one of these discussions that we've had where I'm loath to end the discussion. But my injunction to everyone listening is to continue this conversation amongst yourselves, amongst your friends, amongst your community, and really delve into these subjects on your own after listening to this, and then act. I mean, I think we can all agree that the important thing is to act on these ideas.
Yes. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion with you. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Dr. Bache, would you like to, if you have some contact information, there's so many subjects we didn't get to, but if you have some contact information, you know, talk about your work, you know, to do some plugs.
Well, God, I hate to admit this, but I haven't even, I have a website at the department at the university, but I'm still in the process of putting together my own website, so I can't plug that. But if any of your listeners, I think reading is a great way to free the mind. And if anyone wants to read in some of the areas that I've written in, you can go to Amazon.com. You'll see Dark Night, Early Dawn there. Life Cycles, my book on reincarnation, which is the first book I wrote, which is because I think reincarnation is a fundamental question. Do we live on Earth only once, or do we live on Earth multiple times? You know, it seems like our road divides on how you answer that question. Sure. And we have an extraordinary abundance of empirical evidence that has moved that from a theoretical theological question into an empirical question, a psychological question. And then there's a book called The Living Classroom, which is about fields of consciousness, what happens when people come together in groups, whether these are reading groups, discussion groups, research groups, business groups, or learning groups. There are certain things that begin to manifest at the subtle psychic level, the psychological level. That's what The Living Classroom is about. So from there, in these books and all books, everyone, you go to the bibliography. You follow the references that catch your mind, and one book leads to another book. Pretty soon you got a whole shelf, and pretty soon after that you got a whole bookshelf, and pretty soon you're living in a completely different mind.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And I encourage everybody, at the very least, you have to read Dark Knight Early Dawn. It's fantastic. Dr. Bache, fantastic to have you on. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you very much, guys. It's an honor.
Thank you.
It was a great conversation. Thank you very much. Everyone, Free Radical Media Podcast, Eric Scott Picard, Patrick Ryan, our guests.